Hey, how you doing? So things are finally musical with the synth now, as you would have heard in my last video, and things have progressed very rapidly. I now only have a 50mm gap left to fill in the second box, and then she's basically all done, and then after that's the third box. Oh yeah, it ain't ending here. During my previous uni at semester, I was struggling to balance my usual coursework, my final year projects, the building of modules, and the making and editing of videos. So I basically had to sit down and work out what was most important, and unfortunately the YouTube side of things just had to take a break for a while. But I basically had a vision to get everything musical by the end of last year, so I could start making some proper techno. So anytime I needed a break from school, which let's be real, was pretty freaking often, I just beavered away on one module after another. So now I have a full little drum section with a drum sequencer, a quantizer, more ADSRs. There's a lot of things that I've worked on. But the star of today's episode is Gerald. Yes, after 7 months, the damn thing is finally done. And I must say myself, it's looking pretty freaking awesome. I decided to stick with the name Gerald because, well, it's fucking funny. Last year for my birthday, my girlfriend treated me to the world's nerdiest gift, and let me go ham with cheap components and parts from AliExpress. So of course I stocked up on like, everything. But I basically got all of the jacks, pots and switches needed to make the sequencer, and then got to work straight away once it all arrived. I think the total time spent from designing it and filming the whole process, building it, installing it, and then troubleshooting probably would have been a good solid month or two. So to see it finally done is a weight off my shoulders in a way, because this was a big project. But to pick up from where we left off in the last episode, I think we might need a little help travelling through the fabric of space and time.
You have set the date to Tuesday the 6th of July 2021, the time to 14:38 hours and the location to your backyard shed. We will depart in T-15 seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Have a country morning.
What? Why aren't we moving?
Tired of hearing ads every time you want to travel through time and space? Sign up for Time Travel Premium today.
Oh, for crying out loud. Every time I'm just about to leave, I have to go through this shit. Yes, I'm tired of your stupid ads.
Hey, I can hear you. You could just pay the monthly subscription fee, and you wouldn't have to hear my voice every single time you want to time travel. I mean, come on, it's only $10 a month, you freaking cheapskate.
Yeah, whatever. My finances are in flux at the moment. Can we just get moving, please?
Hey, don't ask me, man. I ain't in control of this thing.
Yes, we will leave now.
Bloody technology. Alright, so my big box of Gerald's has arrived. Let's cut it open and see how they've turned out. Ooh, we got the puzzle this time. Make that later. Fuck, these are massive. Jesus Christ. Yeah, alright. Like, I knew these PCBs were going to be really big, but jeez. These are just monstrous. They never make these bloody packets easy to get into. Let me in. Come on. I've really vacuum sealed them as tight as they can. Alright. slide out nicely. There we go. Wow. What an absolute monster. That's fantastic. Oh, God. Ah, big scratcher on the other one. God, I'm an idiot. I'll just put that one in the bottom. Pretend that didn't happen. This is going to be one hell of a soldering job, that's for sure. Very good. I'm happy with that. So because of the sheer amount of components that I'm going to have to solder into this circuit board, I'm going to have to wait a few weeks until all the jacks, pots and switches arrive before I can fully solder this all together. But while I'm waiting for those parts, I can at least make a bit of a start, say with the caps and the resistors and just all those little odd bits and pieces here and there. And at least just be able to slowly build this thing together. So for you guys, it'll all happen over the course of 10 minutes or so, but for me, I think it's going to take a few weeks to build this whole thing. Alright, so let's start soldering this beast together. So, cue the time-lapse montage. And we're back to the present. As you saw, it was a massive job soldering and wiring this thing together. And by Jove, do I never want to have to put myself through something like that again. Lordy. But the main thing is that it's done, and it works. Mostly. There's a few bugs that I've noticed here and there, but we'll get to them later on. So without further ado, let's take a look at how the module actually works, and make a patch with it. So first off, we'll take a look at the control panel. This was originally meant to be a part of the main sequence panel, but I made it too small. So I ended up just having to make a separate panel for all the controls and then just bridging the two together. But the main thing to know is that both panels are basically split down the middle lengthways. So everything on this top half controls everything on the top sequencer, and then everything on this bottom half controls everything on the bottom sequencer. And all the controls are exactly the same for both, with the exception of the cascade mode switch here on the bottom sequencer. But moving from left to right and top to bottom, we first have the clock enable input, so we have control over when the sequence is active. Next to that is the clock input with an LED for indication, which we can see flashing away right now. Then we have the CV input and switch for the 8-step or 1 to N mode. Then on the right, we have our sync CV input and switch, so we can reset the sequence when we move from 1 to N to 8-step mode. Then moving down, we have our CV inputs and switches to select our sequence length according to a 3-digit binary number, when used in 1 to N mode. So if I switch the sequence to 1 to N mode, and then toggle these switches, we can see the sequence length display over here, changing on the main panel. and the same again when I use an external gate signal. As mentioned before, all the bottom controls on the panel function in the exact same way as the top, except for this extra switch below the clock input here, where we can select the bottom sequencer to be in cascade mode, meaning that every time the top sequence resets back to the start, the bottom sequence will then advance by one step, like so. The bottom clock input is also normal to the top input, so that they both receive the same clock signal until another one is inserted into the bottom input. Alright, so let's take a look at the main sequencer panel controls. First off is the step LEDs, just used to indicate what each current step is. Then as you can see, for every step in the sequence, we also have a series of switches, allowing us to independently turn on or off either the step itself or the gate signal that is being produced. So if I flick a few random ones on and off, we can also see how the step and gate counters will go blank for those steps, as well as the gate LED flicking on and off to indicate our gate output signal. Moving below the LEDs, we have the series of pots used to adjust the pitch CV on each active step. Then that last pot over here is used for the slide functionality, allowing us to glide between the notes in our sequence, with the pitch CV output next to that. On the far right, we also have the carry out outputs from the counter chips, where it can be used to control any number of other modules. And same as the control panel, everything on the bottom here functions in the exact same way as the top. Alright, so that's it for how it works, so let's get into a patch. A step sequencer is most often used to create repeating melodies or bass lines, used to underpin the groove of a song. So let's use Gerald to make a simple 8-step melody. So what I have is a VCO into a VCF, then into a VCA, into the effects, and then the dual drive and distort to boost the signal back up again, and then finally into the mixer so we can hear it. The sequencer pitch output is then going into the volt per octave input on the VCO. We then also have the gate signal going into an envelope generator, and then being malted and sent to the VCA and the VCF. And then finally, we're using the crazy clock to drive the sequencer. So if I now unmute the mixer, we can hear the little melody that Gerald is producing. And if I turn a few steps and gates on and off, we can hear the effect it has in that little melody. But let's get one thing out of the way first. Who else here agrees that this melody actually sucks and sounds really shit? See, a sequencer can be used to make melodies, sure, but the trick is to make good melodies that sound in tune and in key. And unless I want to be sitting here for days on end getting every step perfectly in tune, then we're going to need a better solution. So spoiler alert for a future episode, the real magic to making decent melodies is to first take the pitch output from the sequencer, then put it into a pitch quantizer, and then into the VCO. The pitch quantizer is the magic puzzle piece used to keep everything in a particular key or scale. It can basically be fed any CV input, such as the pitch output from Gerald, or the Turing machine, or even the random output that is generated from a sample and hold. And it will then quantize the CV into a particular key or scale, such as A minor, D major, F sharp natural minor, whatever really, which can then be used to produce instant in-key melodies from a VCO. Brilliant. We'll obviously cover the quantizer in greater detail in a future episode, but that's just a brief little overview to give you an idea of what's going on. Okay, so our melody is now in tune, but we still have one other problem left to deal with. See this gate LED here? See how it will stay on when there's multiple active steps in a row, rather than producing a single gate on every active step. Well, I worked out that if I fed the gate signal from the sequencer and a copy of the clock signal into an AND gate, then I could produce a gate on every active step. Like so. Now we're starting to get somewhere with our melody. So now it's just a matter of throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks, by turning steps or gates on and off, or changing the notes in the sequence, and just sticking with what sounds good. Plus we can also send external gate signals into the control panel to adjust how long the sequence is, or when the sequence is active. But to be fair, I haven't actually found myself using these controls that often. Yet. We can also use the slide pot to adjust how much the notes glide between one another. But I found that when I use the slide before the quantizer, the melody will glide between all of the available notes until the next one is reached in the active step. If that sounds a bit confusing, let's just have a listen. So that's why I've built a separate slide module, so that we can feed the volt per octave signal from the quantizer into this, and then into the VCO. Then we can adjust how much slide we have between the two selected notes in a step, like so. So I've moved our sequence to the top one so that I can use the bottom sequencer to demonstrate the cascade mode. So if I flick this switch down, then we can now see that for every repeat of the top sequence, the bottom one will now advance by one step. And if I now change the bottom sequencer into 1 to n mode, and then adjust the switches for a 4-step sequence, then we'll now have 4 repeating steps for every 4 repeats, or bars of the top sequence. So let's now use this bottom sequencer to control some chords over the top of our melody. So we now have some chords over the top of our melody, but it is, however, completely out of tune. So if I quickly change the quantizer to octaves, then it will only play the root note of our scale from the melody. So I can then use this to tune our chord to the scale of our melody. And hey presto, we're back in business again. So now I can use the bottom sequencer to adjust the type of chord, such as major or minor, or the chord inversion for every repeat of the melody. But since I don't know my music theory very well, let's use it to control the chord inversion, where certain notes are shifted up or down an octave or two, which always sounds really nice and still stays perfectly in tune. Now I don't have another AND gate to produce individual gate signals for the chords, but what we can do is just use the triangle wave LFO to create a bit of movement to the filter, just to add a little bit more dynamics. Alright, so we've got a pretty cool little melody chord combination going on. All I think we have left now to do is just melt the clock signal to drive the drum sequencer, and then add a little bit of rhythm using the kick, snare and hat modules. So we can now see that both of the sequences are now moving in time together. But if I change the clock back to manual mode, then we'll see that the steps between the two sequences are completely shifted from one another. Gerald's top sequencer is on step 8, and we can see that the drum sequencer is on the second step. So what I can now do is flick our manual clock switch until the drum sequencer is on the first step of the first bar. Then if I now quickly flick the 8 step or 1 to end switch up and down, we can see that both of Gerald's sequences are reset back to the start. So if I now flick the clock back to auto mode, we can now hear our little song going again, completely in tune and synchronized in time. Alright, so obviously I could be here for days talking about all the different ways that we can possibly use the sequences, either together or independently. So I think I'll leave the big sound demo at that for today. But using a step sequencer to make melodies isn't the only way that it can be used. We can also use it as a gate sequencer to create rhythms from envelopes. Or to trigger a dedicated pattern for a drum module. We can also finally adjust any possible CV input on another module using the pots for each step. The possibilities are pretty endless really with a sequencer in the system, and a dual one at that. At the start, I mentioned that I've noticed a few bugs with Gerald, or maybe they're features at this point. But for some reason, I can't set the two sequencers to two different independent step lengths. So I can't set the top one to 5 steps, and the bottom one to 7 steps for example. It just goes to the default 8 steps and gets all weird. And if I do want a different length sequence, then they both must be set to the same sequence length to work. So if I want the top sequencer to be 5 steps, then the bottom one also has to be 5 steps for it to work. Also, it doesn't like any other clock signal unless it's from the crazy clock. So I can't do any varying clock speeds like from a voltage controlled LFO, or even use the clock divisions. So using it for generative music at this stage isn't really happening. I think the bugs just come down to the sheer size of the PCB and number of components on it. Plus I relied on an auto router for some of the really long connections. So there was probably a lot of crosstalk between the different sections of the circuit, affecting things in nefarious ways. There's honestly far too many points of contention to really try and work out where the issue lies. Plus the way the board is wired together means that access to any connections is basically nigh impossible. But hey, it was a good learning exercise in that I never want to build something this big again. Lesson learned really. Keep it simple, stupid. Alright, so that's it for today's episode. I'm back to school at the end of the month, so I don't know how often I'll be able to pump out these videos. But keep your eyes peeled. I'll try and aim for maybe one video a month, depending on my coursework load. But until next time, I'll see you later.